Well, the date is May 10th, 2008, and ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to American patriot William C. Sharp. He is 89 years old and one of those heroic individuals who risked death countless times over the skies in Germany during World War II, protecting our country, culture, and way of life when fighting against the most awesome war machine the world has ever known. I feel privileged to be here in your presence and conduct this interview. Um, My first question would be, where did you live and what were you doing at the time war was declared in 1941?
My home was Columbus, Ohio, but I had been in the service for a year when the war broke out and had gotten my pilot training during 1941 at Parks Air College, East St. Louis for primary, uh, Randolph Field, Texas for basic, and Kelly Field, Texas for advanced flight training. And I got my wings in the 31st of October 41. And I went to my first station a week after that, which was Gowan Field, Boise, Idaho. And that's where I was when the Japs hit Pearl Harbor.
Right. Well, what type of missions did you fly?
At Gowan Field?
Yes.
Well, we had a shortage of airplanes, and we were getting our 4 hours a month in flying Stearman biplanes, because that's all they had. About halfway through the month, they started bringing in B-26s from Langley Field, Virginia, and that was the first squadron other than Langley that had B-26s, and it was the old short wing original B-26 airplane, which was a beast.
And thus earned the nickname Widowmaker?
Yes.
What was your impression of that?
Widowmaker, the Baltimore Whore, a few other choice names.
Yeah. Well, what was your impression of it? You know, its good points and bad points?
I couldn't wait to get my hands on it, but we received 5 planes from Langley into Boise, and guess who got checked out first? All the brass, the lieutenant colonels and colonels, squadron commanders, group commanders, they all had priority time, and we second lieutenants and first and second Louis were sweating them out, waiting for them to get their positions over with. And the trouble is, it was such a hot airplane that they wiped out all 5 of the planes within 30 days. There wasn't a flyable airplane left. And that's where we were when Pearl Harbor happened. We didn't have a flyable. All we were flying in those days was some old Douglas B-18s, which was a terribly slow, antiquated plane, and that's what the U.S. Army Air Corps had prior to the B-25 and the B-26, which wasn't saying much. We were ill prepared and very caught short, you might say.
Well, how did you feel every time you climbed to altitude and headed into war?
Well, some years later is when I went into combat, and you think long and hard when you're getting into the mission, and say a little prayer that you're going to come back, because I had a family at that time. I was married and had one son, and naturally I wanted to come back. So it was a thriller to go up to altitude. We flew most of our missions at 12,000 feet because the B-26 did not have oxygen equipment. and therefore we had to stay below the level where you needed oxygen. And almost all of our missions were between 12 and 13,000 feet. And the German ACAC that was right where they were at their best. They were very, very accurate at that time.
Incredible. Well, how did the gunners that were aboard the bombers manage to avoid shooting other bombers, in formation when shooting at attacking fighters?
Well, the way the formations were, nobody was in the field of fire that was in our group. And we flew tight formations so that we would be able to bring the most number of guns to bear on the enemy. And I can tell you that the formations got real tight and snug when fighter planes or whenever there was a threat. There was no loose stragglers. They all flew very good, tight formation.
Well, did you ever think about the people on the ground miles below when the bombs were dropped?
Yes, I didn't dwell on it, but I was mostly just pretty much concerned about what the target was, and that we were going to hit the target. Yeah. And most of our targets were strategic, like railroad marshaling yards, bridges, important bridges, ammunition dumps, gasoline storage dumps. That was our kind of targets. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't really drop bombs on cities except when the 7th Army was going into a target area. We would pretty much pave the way for them so that they wouldn't have to take so much shooting and killing. Oh, yeah. The first 1/3 of any town was pretty well devastated by the time the ground forces would go in. Mm-hmm. And that was the idea of to save lives in their cases.
Right. Did you have fighter escorts, and what types of fighters were they?
We did have fighter escorts. We would usually pick them up when we'd get to the close to the German border. They were in the right on the border between France and Germany. So we would pick up our escorts after about a half an hour. They'd always join up with us, and happy sight, I might say, to see them. And they made up of F-51 Mustangs, the what'd you call them?
Red tails.
Red tails. Yeah, and also the P-47 Thunderbolt, which we called Jugs. And they were single-engine radial airplanes that had capability of flying high altitude because they had superchargers. Mm-hmm. And they were a very good plane, but of course they couldn't hold their own against some of the German fighters which were lighter and faster. But they did well, and we were always happy to see them. And when they'd run out of fuel, we were sorry to see them because we were then on our own. Yeah. And very vulnerable. Yeah. To both German aircraft and German ACAC.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, fascinating. Well, what was life like on the base in France, for example?
Very grim. I lived with 3 other fellows in the chicken coop of a French farmer. He cleaned out his chicken coop, and we made room for 4 cots, and the little pot-bellied stove in the middle to heat. And it was a cold winter. Winter of 44, 45 was one of the coldest on record. So we were always looking for something to get that pot-bellied stove going.
Yeah.
And I made the mistake one day of throwing a cup full of 100-octane gasoline in and blew the chimney off.
Oh, really?
I wasn't very popular that day. There was black soot all over everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that.
That's something. I'm curious, what was the worst mission that you flew and why?
I think the worst mission that I flew was when we were struck for the first time by the Messerschmitt 262 twin-engine jet, which was late coming, thank God, in the war. And if it had been around a long time, we would have suffered dire consequences because they had their aces flying them. In other words, that was a privilege to fly their 262. They had their German aces. It was sort of a reward for them, and they were good. And fortunately, they didn't have very much fuel, and a good, if they could stay up for an hour, that was about the best they could do. Thank God they didn't have refueling in flight like they do today. So we were awfully glad when they were exhausted, but usually they'd take out 2 or 3 of our planes in their group on each sweep, because they were very good, and our gunners were not prepared to lead something that fast. They were used to the ME 109s and the Focke-Wulf 190, which were more like our F-51 Mustangs, our P-47 Thunderbolt Jug plane. They were of that same caliber in speed-wise, and so our gunners were pretty good at shooting at them. But this jet, they weren't ready for that kind of stuff. Yeah. Didn't put enough lead on them. Right. And so we just were thankful that they were late in the game.
Yeah. It's kind of a related question to the last one, but it brings me to, how did you feel about American aircraft technology compared to German aircraft technology at the time?
Well, I always thought the B-26 was a very fine piece of machinery. It had its drawbacks, but it was also a plane that would take a lot of punishment, both from flak and from fighter shooting. You could come back sometimes when most planes wouldn't. They took a lot of punishment. And I came back from 3 different missions when my plane, when we got back, was so shot up that they just scrapped it and used it for spare parts. And on one, there was a hole in the wing big enough for me to jump through, and I think if I had known that was there, I would have freaked out on the mission because I wouldn't have expected the thing to hold together that long, but fortunately got back. I was very lucky. A lot of my flight mates weren't, and I've lost a lot of them, and we hated to see them go down because we'd sit there and wait to see parachutes open, and if they didn't open, then we knew they were gone. But sometimes they were in a spin, and they were probably glued to their seats or couldn't make the exit.
That was?
The hole was right here in this left wing, and the Curtiss electric propeller was shot clear off so that I had no control over the propeller. I had put it in fixed pitch and flew home with it in fixed pitch, and then was just lucky to be able to stay afloat, because with that much power gone, I couldn't stay with the formation. And so we were kind of sitting ducks. They loved to get stragglers, and we were very vulnerable. Fortunately, I guess they didn't see us, and we were able to limp back across into our home territory. But I had no idea that the plane was so badly damaged. I knew that the propeller control, Curtiss Electric propeller control, was shot clear away. But I didn't know about this big hole. I did know it was hard to keep the plane flying straight and level. And I knew we were losing altitude all the time. And fortunately, we had enough altitude to crawl into our base and make a hairy landing.
Right.
They had the meat wagons out, the ambulances, and were ready to sweep us up with a broom, but we got back in one piece. The only thing is they just took that plane, towed it over to the junkyard, and they used the good engines for replacement engines and, you know, other parts. They just stripped it and used it for parts.
Right.
But it was extremely scary. If I had known how big that hole was, that I could jump through it, I think I wouldn't have made it back.
Yeah.
It just psychologically, I would have probably thought it was impossible.
Incredible.
And so I'm glad I didn't know how badly it
Yeah.
was shot up.
Right. Incredible.
And my gunner, who was up here in this turret, was also a flight engineer, a nice young chap, and he had on that same mission taken a piece of flak, came up through the underside of the airplane and went through his shoe, and he was bleeding profusely in his heel.
Wow.
And so the other guys gave him first aid and put a tourniquet on to stop the bleeding, and he never would fly again. He had already gotten about 35 missions, so he didn't have to.
Incredible.
And he had a wife and family back, and he said, that's it, no more. And they let him get by with it. If he had only had 10 missions, they'd have probably court-martialed him or railroaded him out of the service. But the fact that he had had a full complement of missions and was a brave guy, he just was struck by the fact that he had had a very narrow escape.